There it is.
On it.
Good. And I actually did a little extra work this week and put together a PowerPoint. So I want to see if I can put that up. It's funny because I was working right until when I logged in. This was nice to have a little break to just talk, because I was remembering what people say about Saturday Night Live, which is like, it doesn't go on because it's ready. It goes on because it's 11:30 on Saturday night. And that's kind of how I was feeling about this. So let's see if I can get the presentation up here. There we go. That should do it. So we'll start with the refuge prayer, but one thing I wanted to kind of frame that with was thinking about Sangye, the Tibetan for enlightenment. First part of which, Sang, means fully purified, and the Gye syllable meaning fully flourished. So like when all the stains and obscurations are cleared away, all of what's already there flourishes and grows. And so I think it's the best way for me to relate to this hard to relate to idea of enlightenment. And I also want to keep in mind karma and the concept of causes and results is I think a better way to say it, because it's never one thing and then the other thing. It's always at least two things, and often much more, coming together to create what seems like one result. And karma is also the power of habitual inertia, just the habit energy that just keeps us rolling and doing the same things and same tendencies. Because if we're thinking about successful purification and the subsequent flourishing, we need to cultivate a real awareness of that habit energy. We need to really tune in and feel that inertia moving us in directions, and do what we can to shift that inertia towards virtuous activity and awareness. And that awareness is, of anything that falls into our field of experience, but also recollecting our non-dual ultimate nature. So with that in mind, let's say the prayer of refuge. We'll do it 3 times in English. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of accomplishing generosity and the other perfections, may I attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of accomplishing generosity and the other perfections, may I attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of accomplishing generosity and the other perfections, may I attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. Now I'll say a short prayer of my own. Aden sawe Lama Rinpoche, Naki Chiwo Pediten Jula, Padren Chenpo Goneje Sunte, Usung Tuki Ngajub Sa Usung. Okay. Now I'd like us to start with a short guided practice. So if you would take a posture that's conducive to meditation. And I like, before we do anything like this, to just take a moment as we take a few deep breaths in to begin, to take a moment to check in with our level of arousal on a scale of like 1 to 10, 1 being totally spaced out, dull, 10 being agitated, mind racing. Just take a moment and tune in with you where you're at on that scale. And wherever it is okay. Just recall that we have a window of tolerance that lies between about a 3 and an 8 on that scale. And if we ever feel like we're outside of that window, can always feel free to shift in your seat, do your own practice, or to engage in whatever kind of self-care will help you restore that window. The traditional instruction, if you're feeling agitated, is to lower the gaze or to stop meditating if you're outside your window, and to just kind of let everything relax and move downward towards the ground. If you're feeling dull or spaced out, you can raise your gaze, or if it's a more extreme case, you can stop meditating and tighten everything up and look up and imagine an upward motion. But I want to give another method today, which is an invitation to engage in a little bit of self-contact. And so I would invite you to, by either placing a hand on your heart or a hand on your belly. You might try at the back of your neck, the base of your skull. And find whatever works for you and rest with that for a minute. Especially notice the two aspects of this touch. There's an aspect of receiving care and contact, and there's an aspect of giving care and contact. And whichever one feels better to you at this time, you can put your attention there. But try to do some slow toggling between the two so you can recognize the difference or the seeming difference. And pretty soon we're going to release this self-contact. Getting ready to shift a little bit. Keep in mind that you can always come back to that if you need it, anywhere during the session or anywhere during your day. And then before we move on, let's take one more revisit to our window and see how it feels on that scale. See how it may have changed, or maybe not. That's okay too. And then starting to move a little bit, we'll get ready to move into the conversational portion of the evening. All right, thank you. I found that really helpful for me lately. I forgot sometimes how much that can help regulate things when I'm feeling anxious or spaced out. So there's a section, I've mainly been teaching from this book that Daniel kindly sent me, the Chenrezig Lord of Love book. And there's a section here that I wanted to talk about that is about how Dharma works. The section, he calls it From Impure to Pure. And I want to primarily just share with you what he said, because I thought about teaching this, but he says it so concisely and so well. I want to kind of go through each of these and we can talk about each of them. But I want to read you what he says. He says that there's a process of purification that takes place. And the Dharma is a method that enables us to go from the state of ordinary being to the state of awakened being, called Buddhahood. One can only know the significance of Dharma in its deep purpose if one understands it as a process whose principles are expressed in these terms of purification. They are the base of purification, the object of purification, the purifying agent, and the result of purification. And what he says about the base of purification, he says, the true nature of our own mind is mind in itself, similar to the mode of being of all beings' minds. As such, impurities do not stain it. It is now, however, impregnated by much temporary conditioning. This conditioning does not affect the mind's essence, but produces illusions and suffering. The essence of the mind is called the heart of awakening. It is pure, but due to our lack of realization, the heart of awakening and the impurities are mixed together. This intermixing forms the base of purification, similar to a white fabric dirtied by stains. Because its nature is whiteness, the fabric can become white again. Likewise, the nature of our mind is purity, and we can rediscover it. A coal, however, has no chance of becoming white, since it is originally black. If illusion, duality, and suffering were the nature of our mind, we would not have any possibility to rid ourselves of them. Next, he talks about the object of purification. And he says, the object of purification is that which must be eliminated, namely the illusory impurities similar to the stains covering the white fabric that are not part of its nature. These impurities do not have an actual reality. This is the reason one can eliminate them. If they were endowed with an existence in itself, this would be impossible, but they are contingent of an illusory nature, a simple mistake. Their root is the duality of grasped, grasping. Externally, there are appearances, grasped as objects. Internally, there is a mind as a grasping subject. This polarity causes the production of conflicting emotions. Anger and aversion, desire and attachment, blindness, jealousy, possessiveness, pride, etc. And illusory appearances from which karma and suffering arise. Therefore, duality, the foundation of this process, must be principally eliminated or purified, to use the terms we've been using. And then he gives this really great breakdown of, this is what really struck me, is about duality and what we're doing here. So he explained already, right? We have these externally grasped objects, and then internally we have this grasping subject. And it's because of the space between those, the seeming space between those two, that we have all of our negative emotions arise and bad habits, self-clinging, all of those things arise in that space between the externally grasped objects and the internally grasped subjects. And to look at one example in particular, there's the idea of these external forms. So forms for the visual sense, anything we see. Internally, what grasps at those is our visual consciousness. So we talk about 6 consciousness. Well, we talk about actually 8 or 9, however you look at it, but there's 6 consciousnesses that we are generally aware of. And those are 5 sense consciousnesses and a mental consciousness. And after that, there is what they call like the instantaneous consciousness or the momentary consciousness, klesha consciousness. It's an elusive, slippery one, but it basically, it's where we go wrong from what the 8th consciousness is, which is, you may have heard of like the Alaya Vijnana, the all basis consciousness. That's kind of where all of our karmic tendencies hang out. And then because of this habit energy of duality, we have a sense of, one of the reasons that they call it an instantaneous consciousness is because it gives us a sense that there was a moment, and then there's a moment after that, and then there's a next moment. And it starts to seem like a temporal journey, like we're moving through time, and we're here now and we were there, and That's another form of duality. And then because of that, all these 6 ones that we notice all the time, the sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness, those arise. So if we think just of forms, I think this is, I know, like, I've never heard this from a Tibetan teacher because they don't have the same idioms as us, but like I always feel like this is the same as like if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? Because if there, in this, for us to have an experience, there has to be a form, seemingly external, and then that visual consciousness that's functioning and able, relating with it. And that's the case with all 6 of those consciousnesses. There's sounds need the auditory consciousness, and we need the ability to hear, smells for the olfactory sense, and then we also have to have a functioning olfactory consciousness. And it just seems like these things happen together, or it seems like they happen separately, depending on how you look at it. I mean, I think most of the time we think like that form is out there, and we kind of forget that there's a visual consciousness that has to interact with that for us to even have any experience of it at all. So just recalling this mechanism, recalling this process is one of the things that helps us to have a better idea of how things work. Because it's pretty rare for most of us to just have an experience of being fully awake and I'm Buddha, here I am, I'm Chenrezig, like it's pretty rare that we actually like have that experience directly. But at the same time, we can have something close to that, even in just recalling, even in just remembering in the moment that our experience is not separate from enlightened mind, is a kind of waking up. It's not, we have not finished the path, we have a whole long way to go, but it's where we have to start to shift that habit energy, to shift that karma. That's where shifting the habit inertia really begins, is in just recalling these things, just remembering in the moment that it seems like there's kind of me and that, but those things, neither of them exist on their own. And there's some really interesting stuff if you're looking to dig into Madhyamaka, Son of Wisdom by Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche is an amazing book that goes into great detail about all of these sort of kind of hard to get your head around ideas about separateness and the senses. I remember particularly where he was talking about how it's kind of like the visual consciousness doesn't exist until there's a form. And so which can you say causes which? I mean, and that's beyond my ability to talk about it, but it's fascinating stuff if you want to dig into this stuff. So I want to read the rest of what he said about this. You like that? He says, these 6 objects and consciousnesses are not actually separate entities. For instance, while perceiving a form, although we grasp at 2 entities independent of each other, a perceived object and a perceiving mind, we are making an error. In reality, the form grasped as object is nothing other than the manifestation of the clarity aspect of the mind, while the I subject is nothing other than the emptiness aspect of the same mind. Within the mechanics of illusion, one finds oneself in the situation of looking at oneself as other. It is a little like walking in the sun. Our shadow is detached from us and appears as other. So I want to go back because I think that the key sentence here, we've talked previously about how our true nature has these 2 aspects of emptiness and clarity. He says here, in reality, the form grasped as object is nothing other than the manifestation of the clarity aspect of the mind, while the I subject is nothing other than the emptiness aspect of the mind, both mind. So he goes on to say the externally grasped object and the internally grasping subject who clutches it in truth are never separated. There is no duality. Subject and object are not 2, but because we do not realize it, we enter into a duality with ourselves. This causes the play of conflicting emotions and illusory thoughts. Therefore, one must purify oneself of this polarity of I, other. This is where we go on to the purifying agents. He says, different items such as water, detergent, and soap are necessary to wash a fabric covered with stains. Likewise, to purify our mind, an agent is necessary. This is the Dharma. All its stages, all the aspects that compose it, and all the meditations taught within it participate in this unique purifying function. Taking refuge, preliminary practices, mental calming of Shine, and the superior vision of Latong, the Vajrayana phases of creation and completion, and finally Mahamudra converge on this same goal. Through Dharma, the conflicting emotions and the more evident illusory thoughts are first dissipated. Then progressively, the more subtle aspects are dispersed until finally the last obscuration, the veil that covers knowledge, is eliminated by the ultimate meditation, the Vajra-like samadhi that leads to the final awakening. The meditation of Chenrezig is clearly one of these agents of purification. In particular, by the thought, I am Chenrezig, this is called the pride of the deity, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. One purifies oneself of assimilating an ordinary I. By meditating on the body of the deity, his ornaments, his pure land, and so on, one purifies oneself from the conditioning that produces ordinary appearances. Then we have the result of purification. When the mind is totally purified from the duality of subject-object, the fruit is revealed. Realization of the non-dual truth of the mind. Its nature is not different from the three bodies of awakening, the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya. These three bodies are already present in a latent state at the level of the base of purification. At the level of the result, they are actualized and revealed in their fullness and purity. So in a way, we can think about the base of purification as being Buddha nature, as being Chenrezig. Chenrezig is the embodiment of all enlightened beings. So that base of purification, Chenrezig is there. You know, we can't see all the time because it's obscured. He's obscured. But by the time we clear away all of the obscurations, all of the illusory obscurations and stains, then the result shines through. The purification clears away what was impeding our ability to recognize, and or I should say, it clears away what was preventing the flourishing of that nature, the full flourishing of that nature. Any thoughts on any of this? Because I felt like that was like an awesome way to describe this stuff. That was maybe one of the best presentations of the problem of duality that I'd ever encountered. Oh, Charles, you read it.
It's very similar to the Abhidharma descriptions of the sense doors coming into the consciousness coming into the sense doors. And then every time a contact is made between the sense doors and the consciousness, a feeling arises, and there's a 17-step automatic procedure that it just automatically follows every time. If it's pleasant, it runs after it, and if it's unpleasant, it runs away from it. And it's a subconscious process that keeps us tied in. It also reminds me of the 5 skandhas, which, interestingly, of the 5 skandhas, and you talked about karma here, you've got rupa, which is body. And then the next 4 of the skandhas, or aggregates that comprise an individual, are mental. There's And some of these are so subtle, the differences, I have a hard time, honestly, distinguishing them. But there's said to be an aggregate of perception and an aggregate of consciousness, and then feelings, which kind of make that tie between the body and mind to make the determination of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And then the important skanda or aggregate that binds us together as an individual is that last skanda or aggregate of it's called the sankhara skanda, which binds it, and it's the volitional, it's how we determine these phenomena as they hit us, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And that's where karma is formed. So the other four aggregates simultaneously are going on. We're getting these sensory inputs from all the sense doors, including the mind that you were talking about. But it's our and there's nothing wrong with any of that. And then there's nothing wrong with how we react. Although if we react with ignorance based on not seeing the process of what it is, it binds us further to that process. And if we begin to see it as just forces at work without an individual self, or emptiness, as all operational as just empty phenomena interacting with itself, it helps to untie oneself. And those, I mean, I put my own tint on what I just said, but the Abhidharma is very precise about the different types of consciousness and the different steps of the thought process that goes on as all this occurs. And I agree that what you've just taught or spoken about is absolutely a marvelous. It brings in the Vajrayana and it brings in the visualizations that the Abhidharma doesn't really go into. So thank you. It's a wonderful teaching.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Yeah, and that another way to look at it that you just made me think of too is the three sufferings. We talk about like the suffering of change, and all pervasive suffering. So I love the headache analogy. You know, suffering of suffering is like my head hurts. You know, like this hurts, and we don't like that. The suffering of change is like my head didn't hurt an hour ago, like now it hurts. And the all pervasive suffering is that we have a body that gets headaches. And I this is something I have to qualify that I've never heard somebody else teach this, but it occurred to me that in my practice, I think it's the suffering of change where I have the best chance of making a change for the better. Because that suffering of suffering and the all pervasive suffering, like those things kind of just happen. I don't have, or they seem to, I don't have a lot of ability to impact those. But when something changes, there's inevitably going to be some, like Charles was saying, some reaction of clinging or pushing away or ignorance. And in that moment, if I see something change, I can be awake to, you know, that process kicking in, you know, noticing that car start to move, you know. So I think it's in those moments of noticing a change that we actually have the best chance of impacting that process and maybe pumping the brakes on it, or turning it in another direction.
And I think that we've got equal opportunities with the other two types of suffering, because one thing that we're always calling to mind with the four thoughts that turn the mind towards Dharma and all the rest is the all pervasiveness factor. And that begins to set in and we begin to understand it. And then the suffering of suffering is an understanding. The suffering involved is we suffer like just because of all pervasive suffering, like an animal does perhaps. But the suffering of suffering adds on another layer where we know what it's like to not be suffering. And so we suffer, we heap more suffering on it.
Yeah,
So,
Lama Kathy calls that value-added suffering. I love that description. Neat. Well, I got a couple more things I wanna go through. So we talked a little bit last time about the 2 stages of practice, and I'm kind of wanting to spotlight Bokar Rinpoche here, because this is just really amazing. I had read his book on the Bodhisattva vow, and I think that was the only thing I'd read of his. So I really didn't have my head around how potent his teachings are. So he says about the 2 phases of deity meditation. He says Vajrayana meditations are divided into 2 phases: the phase of creation and the phase of completion. The phase of creation refers to the first part of the meditation, during which one mentally creates the appearance of the deity. The phase of completion refers to the end of the meditation, during which one dissolves the appearances into emptiness. One then dwells in the nature of the mind that is simultaneously an absence of thought and an experience of joy. And he uses this great analogy, since waves have been coming up a lot. When a wave forms on the surface of the ocean, it may appear to be something other than the ocean. However, when it plunges, it descends back into the ocean, which is its own nature. Similarly, the phases of creation and completion are in essence not separated. As with the wave and the ocean, they participate in the same nature. The phase of creation corresponds to the wave that rises up, the phase of completion to the wave that plunges back into the ocean. In both cases, it is the same mind that meditates. There are not 2 different realities. If one does not well understand this relationship, one may perhaps compare the phase of creation to building a house and the phase of completion to its destruction. For beginners, both phases have, it is true, distinct aspects. We first accomplish the phase of creation, during which we visualize the deity and recite the mantra. At the end of this phase, we do the phase of completion, dissolving all appearances into emptiness. At a more advanced level, however, the 2 phases are undifferentiated. The phase of creation begins with the emptiness of mind from which one creates an image. For example, you can invoke an image of the city of Paris in your mind. You see the buildings that you know, the streets that are familiar to you, and so on. All that appears clearly. While this manifestation occurs, it is, however, empty, devoid of any material reality or independent entity. This emptiness is the phase of completion. The 2 phases are present simultaneously. The visualized appearances are empty, and even though empty, they still occur. This is the union of manifestation and emptiness. When we visualize Chenrezig, we clearly see his face, his arms, his jewels, and the different colors. This is the phase of creation. At the same time, Chenrezig is without material existence. This is the phase of completion. Likewise, sounds are simultaneously sound and emptiness. Thoughts are simultaneously consciousness and emptiness. Each thought that arises in our mind actually contains in itself the 2 phases of creation and completion. This is the nature of the 2 phases. Such good stuff. So we talked a little bit last time. There's it said that there's 3 characteristics of the creation stage, and I think we've talked a pretty good amount about the clarity of appearance, and we've touched on stable pride. But with what we've discussed today, I want to talk specifically about recollection of the pure meaning. And I remember when I tried to explain to my mom, I think we were driving to Karmiling. I think it was when I took my mom to meet Rinpoche. That was really beautiful. Mom is like not a Buddhist, and initially was really not comfortable with me becoming one. Not because she like wishes I was Christian or anything. She just was like me, a big skeptic, you know, like, and I'd kind of like jump ship on the skeptic boat. So I remember when we were driving up there, talking about meditational deities, and one of the ways I found to explain it to her to make her feel a little bit better is that, in a way, I mean, this is a crude way of explaining it, but in a way, when we look at a picture of Chenrezig or one of our meditational deities, we're kind of looking at a cliff notes for enlightenment in a picture. And that's a little bit of like what we're talking about with this recollection of the purity. Each aspect of the body of these deities has a meaning. And to introduce this, I want to read one more paragraph here from Bokar Rinpoche. He says, in truth, the visualization exists only in our mind, and therefore there is no subject who observes or an observed object. Our habitual tendencies predispose us, even in this case, to maintain the duality of subject and object. That was a big one. It exists only in our mind, and there is no subject who observes or an observed object, but our habitual tendencies predispose us, even in this case, to maintain the duality of subject-object. It is only after long experience in meditation and with a certain understanding of the nature of mind that the visualization is no longer colored by erroneous notions of subject and object. Temporarily, the beginning meditator can simply consider the visualization as an object that the mind observes and try to make it clear and stable, allowing the mind to become calm. I take that as a first step approach. And he goes on to explain some of the meanings of what we see in our visualization of Chenrezig. He says, the clarity of the visualization should not become the perception of a divine object that might actually exist materially, even on a plane more beautiful or higher than ours. I feel like when I read his teachings, he's like pointing out every mistake I make all the time. Like he's just nailing it. The clarity of the visualization should not become the perception of a divine object that might actually exist materially, even on a plane more beautiful or higher than our own. The deity is simultaneously an appearance, yet absent of inherent reality, as an image in a mirror or the reflection of the moon on water. The visualized deity is not of the same nature as a tanka or a statue. It is devoid of material existence and at the same time endowed with the qualities of the awakened mind. The grasping of material reality in the deity is neutralized by recollection of the pure meaning. So recalling these, the meaning of these aspects of the deity is how we neutralize that grasping at the material reality. And he says, this means remembering that every visualized aspect expresses the qualities of awakening as a symbolic relationship. Thus, each detail of Chenrezig has a meaning. So, for instance, it said that he has one face because the essence of all phenomena is of the same taste. So thinking about karma with these things, I've heard other descriptions of deities too, where it's much more directly said that like, because they generated this aspiration or because they achieved this realization, this physical embodiment occurred or that this shape happened. So we can kind of think of it that way. Because he has realized the essence of all phenomena is of the same taste, he has one face. The four arms represent the four immeasurables of love, compassion, bliss, and equanimity. You can see this is last minute. I forgot to close parentheses. The mala that he has in his right hand is that he draws all beings towards liberation. Lotus represents compassion for all beings, and that he works in the world without being stained by conflicting emotions and imperfections. I want to jump back real quick because this one occurred to me earlier when I was practicing, and I was, they call it telling the mala, pulling the beads, like recognizing that, like drawing beings towards liberation as I say the mantra. I was like, it felt really good. So I would just recommend that. And then we have in his hand the wish fulfilling jewel. He accomplishes the benefit of all beings and satisfies their needs. So, if we could accomplish that, we can, but if we could right now accomplish the benefit of all beings and satisfy all their needs, it would be like we held a wish fulfilling jewel. And there is some teaching like this, as far as Charles may be able to correct me on this, but I would assume this kind of a list of what every aspect of the deity represents exists for every deity in some way or another. Now, I've heard them as different, so it's not always like one face means this or two legs means that. It can be different deity to deity, but I do think that this is like one of the things that you find in common in these practices. I'm not going to go through this whole list, but just a couple other ones. His two legs crossed in the Vajra posture represents that he does not dwell in the extremes of nirvana for himself or in samsara. He unites compassion and emptiness. So that's another kind of thing that I try to do in the morning when I sit down. I usually don't do Vajra posture. I can still do it from retreat, but I cannot stay there long. But when I get in and I cross the legs, I think about that. That's something I think about, like not hanging out in nirvana, not hanging out in samsara. And all of these recollections, they have an impact on the mind. They have an impact on that inertia. They have an impact on our karma. And that karma, when it's negative, is what is causing those obscurations. So we need to, or it's part of the process, I should say. That was not accurate. But we need to impact that karma if we want to shift this habitual creation of obscurations and habitual clinging to this concept of self, and which really just means, in the context of what we're talking about today, clinging to duality. The other one I wanted to bring up was, because I still don't have my head around this, the deer on Chenrezig's shoulder. He says the deer skin on his shoulder represents the legendary, or he says the legendary kindness of the deer symbolizes the mind of awakening, with all thought turned toward the benefit of beings. That one I haven't been able to get my head around, because when I see people who have deer heads on their walls and stuff, that one, I don't know. I guess I just think of the deer as sleeping, but I think the idea is that the deer is a skin. And I gotta say, I don't totally understand that. If anyone else has heard, teachers, yes, please, Charles.
So I don't know the name of the type of deer, but the deer, I believe that this type of deer that he's wearing, it's a different name than deer, but it's a similar animal, but it lives to give its life to the benefit of other beings. So in whatever way it can help, it just gives itself. So that by wearing it on his shoulders, he's getting some benefit, the warmth or whatever other benefit, but it symbolizes that commitment to other beings to the point of actually giving one's life.
That's
think
neat.
that's what I think.
I don't think I'd ever heard that one. I like that.
Yeah.
It's a something Agara deer, I think. I can't remember the name. It's like a Vinagara, or maybe I'm wrong. I'm
probably
wrong,
can Google it just a second.
I did. I'm not seeing it yet, though. I hadn't found it.
I believe Lama Kathy uses the word Tinasara.
That's it. Yep. Correct. Yep.
And is that the name of the animal, Bruce? Tinasara?
No, I think, well, I recall from her teaching it, she says she uses the phrase Tinasara deer. So I don't really know more than that.
That sounds familiar.
That does.
So I I wanted to end there because he goes on to say, like, when we're doing this practice, we're not supposed to be just like constantly reciting the meanings, okay, his face is this, his arms are that, neck is that. But it is just that the maintaining the recollection, knowing that while we do the practice, is what's important. So any other thoughts? Oh, go ahead, Charles.
I'd be happy to read. It is Thinasara deer, and it is the original thing I had actually described that deer as being willing to give itself to the benefit of others ultimately. And then I clicked on that link and it took me to the Chenrezig practice. So
that's cool.
Yeah, but thank you, Bruce. That's what we were looking for. It's a type of deer.
Yeah, good memory.
The Thinasara deer. Here, I'll read. Over his left shoulder, covering his left breast, is the skin of a Thinasara deer, a legendary animal said to be so kind that it never harms any being and is ... And then I clicked on it and it went to Chenrezig. So I can't read that further, but that may help towards understanding more deer skin.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that helped me a lot. Because there are a lot of, I think there's another balance to be had here, right? Because he specifically says this is not the same nature as a tanka or a statue. So I know sometimes people will ask, like, well, when we visualize, do we visualize it like in the tanka? And that, I feel like that's a tricky question, right? Because we can know what the elements are and we can recall the purity, recall what they mean, maybe how they arose. But it isn't exactly like in the tanka, because the tanka is a two-dimensional painting. Like we have to actually imbue our visualization with a recollection of the true nature of emptiness. And that's why we're instructed to visualize as made of light. But it's interesting how we visualized, and we need to, yes, do it like the tanka, but also recall that we can't just make it a picture. And we also can't turn it into some magical being that's in another land, like you said, some material god or something. I'm excited. You guys are doing a Chenrezig with Lama Karma in a couple weeks.
Well, we've changed that. He's unable. Okay. He's unable to come, but we are going to meet by Zoom with him for at least 1 day workshop, and he's giving the lineage from Tilopa, obviously Vajradhara, starting with Vajradhara, Tilopa, Naropa, Marpa, Milarepa, Gampopa. He's going to talk about each of those.
Oh yeah.
Life stories of each of them. So it'll be very valuable because, we don't hear that a lot.
Yeah.
And then we're getting together to sign we're coming together as a Sangha to sign the board to sign our organizing documents as sent to us by KTD, the new bylaws and other organizing documents. So we're having a lot of fun these last couple of weeks of June.
Good. Is it? That's cool. I wasn't sure when you said that last part if you were joking, because I know sometimes the paperwork
I'm the one
can
having
be
fun because I'm creating our local rules and regulations, and I have yet to spring that on everybody. And then Wendy's working on the finances so we can see our monthly statements and be able to understand it. So it's quite exciting. I'm genuinely excited. I don't mean, there's no cynicism.
Good.
I have a quick question. So, when I first started to practice Chenrezig, you could get the deity cards, because when I first started practice, it was like, there's so much. So, when you practice with the deity card, it almost, it tends to have Chenrezig be a form, because when you first start to visualize, it's hard to visualize any other way. And then as practice goes on, and we picture Chenrezig overheads, or we picture, Chenrezig being not solid, and then at the end dissolving into us. But I always seem to gravitate, because that was my early practice, back to thinking about Chenrezig, and whether it be on a tanka, but I think more about Chenrezig on this little deity card. So sometimes I do hold on to that. I attach to that instead of, I'm just saying that can you talk about that a little bit? How do you gravitate away from that you just fall to, into always seeing it, Chenrezig as not a solid form?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing, and I don't mean this to sound flip at all, but that's inseparable from Chenrezig too. So
Right. Yeah.
that's one of those things that, like, quick simple answer is just recall that, like, that experience and that image is also inseparable from Chenrezig's form. So that's kind of the quick answer. But that's an interesting question. So you're saying, like, you kind of like see in your mind a mental picture of the Pecha card.
Yep. That's where my mind goes first a lot when I think about Chenrezig, because that's what I did week in and week out. And what, every time I practice, it's like my deity card, there's Chenrezig, there it is. And I used to, so that's my go-to picture. That's my go-to thought of Chenrezig.
So I would suggest maybe kind of taking that because you have a memory of that form, and trying in your mind to make it 3D and turn it.
Oh yeah.
Like, see if you can kind of go to the side, and even just if you can kind of turn it a little bit, you'll start to get that 3-dimensional filling out, and then also recalling while you're doing that it's insubstantial,
Well, I'm going to do that.
So you don't cling to the idea of it being solid, like it's not like this side and that side, it's just, where you are, your relative view of Chenrezig. It's not actually this side of Chenrezig and that side of Chenrezig. It's what your view is, and you're shifting your view, kind of turning the deity in your mind.
Well, I like it because I am very visual. It's like I'm picturing doing it on my computer. So yeah, I could do, that's great. Thank you.
I'm thinking of, like, you're welcome. I'm thinking of the things in, like, Star Trek and Star Wars, where they have those tables where the hologram goes,
right.
and
they can move it. Yep, 100%. I can do that. Thank you, Lama.
Good. You're welcome. Yeah.
I once saw years ago I think the Dalai Lama's Sangha put this out of a visualization of a mantra. I don't know which one it was, but it showed the arisal of a hung, I think, and the dismantling of it, and the turning of it. But what was interesting, there was no sound to it. It was what the visualization is that we're supposed to be doing. I wish I knew more about this particular film, but you're mentioning the 3D figures coming up, like we see on Star Trek. And why has that not yet been created for Chenrezig and for all these deities, for the different practices? Because I found that one movie that I saw of just the mantra performing, it was so interesting because it was just coming up, arising, like as if from nowhere, without the sound. With no sound made it, to me, more powerful, because it was just it was doing its own thing, or its dance, so to speak. And I've waited for 3D, like, they talk about these headsets you put on that are 3D, that are so real. Well, come on, we can be walking through the Bardo. We could have Bardo visions and all sorts of things. You have any friends in Japan that can put this thing together?
But I have a VR headset, so I would like one of those. But I was thinking, was it Mandalorian where they had that like little coin and they put it on a table and push the thing and then right? Yeah, I feel like that would be awesome if instead of picture cards, we had little hologram like discs.
That's
With a
Well,
little
Star Trek.
picture clip, so you can put it on top of your pager holder.
Yeah. I think this is doable, to be honest. Y'all.
Well, it is. I just don't understand why it hasn't been done yet, or if it has, why don't we know about it?
We're going to call it Dharma in 3D.
Yeah. You know what we need to talk to is our friends in Flushing, the people who have connections in China, you know, because there's a lot of Buddhists in Flushing, New York, you know. They could make it on large scale and cheap.
Well, you're the one that meets with them, so please feel free to.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. That would be a great fundraiser. You know, if we could get those made and then the KTCs sell
Oh my
those.
gosh, can you imagine?
100%.
Wow.
Oh my God.
Holograph. Wow.
Everybody, Biba.
And you only need one, because you can program it to all the different deities you need for the practice. That would be perfect. Imagine
You're
if you
right.
go to a nunnery, it gives you all the visualizations.
See, it just got easier because somebody probably already made that.
I know. Yeah.
We just have to make the actual holograms.
Yeah.
Oh, I want one.
Hmm.
Come
I know, I
on,
do
Matt,
too.
you're a computer person.
Well, I don't know anything about virtual reality 3D. I can only play with the computer. I can't look inside. Wendy knows inside of the computer more than anyone. Actually,
Really?
yeah.
Yeah, good.
Wendy, you're a programmer, aren't you?
No, not anymore. Long time ago, I used to do.
Can I ask one more question? I don't know if I'm going to put this together right, but sorry, I have a bit of a cold. So I find myself, I would say torn is maybe the right word for it. Sometimes between the intellectual understanding of Chenrezig, of the parts, of the visualizations, of how, you know, all the things we just talked about. But then when it comes to actual practice, I feel that, first of all, I forget all the sort of things under the hood. And I also have the feeling that there is the big experiential factor to it of experiencing certain things, like feeling a connection to Chenrezig, like even to the point of feeling compassion towards other beings and all this kind of things. And in my mind, I guess that's the question, is I'm hoping, I'm saying to myself, although in the moment when I practice and if I do visualizations, I don't have all the intellectual understanding in this very moment, I do trust that these mechanisms, so to speak, still work without any knowledge. Because I'm also thinking, surely, you know, I mean, we are a let's call it well-trained intellectual bunch, but there's a million, thousand, I don't know how many Buddhists out there who have no intellectual or even, you know, schooling, but they also still do the practices. And it seems to work on them as well. Does that make any sense? So in other words, like from my personal experiences, in the moment I do the practice, whatever it is, if it's sitting meditation, I basically don't do all this thinking about how it actually works, but try to, I'm not saying I'm anywhere near to, but try to actually experience it. But of course, what I experience is I don't know if that's the right thing or not, but I'm sort of relying on it. Does that make sense? That I guess it's again a sort of duality of sort of knowing everything logically, but at the same time, it also exists almost on its own. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Like, can I rely on it, even if I not completely understand it or even recall all those things while I'm doing the practice?
Well, I think yeah, because when I hear you talk about relying on, what I'm hearing is like devotion.
Mm-hmm.
Can you have confidence, in the method of the practice? And this book, and I mean, I'm sure other books, they don't say that the practice is to actually, like you said, like don't sit there reciting what all the parts mean. But to me, that aspect of it is like something I'll think about, as I'm getting ready to meditate or during the day, like that is an intellectual pursuit. I mean, it has benefit, but yeah, I think that, the other thing I was thinking about, I meant to mention this earlier, but when we were talking about the purifying agent of Dharma, I think it's interesting because I sometimes I forget that like Dharma isn't part of the true nature. Like we always hold up this idea of like, ultimate truth. And then we also talk about how great Dharma is, but the Dharma is just what does the purifying, and it's, there's all these teachings about, leaving it behind once we get to the other shore to enlightenment, so it isn't the Dharma. We can say it's inseparable from our ultimate nature, but it isn't like, it's like this it's going to be like ultimate truth and Dharma, so it is the case that like just doing the practices and using what we've learned is the path. But in the moment, it is definitely about some sort of one-pointedness, whether it's one-pointedness on the mantra or one-pointedness on the visualization, as well as in one-pointedness, of course, also implies not fighting away other things in our experience if things arise. But I do think that's totally fine. And I think I can relate, because I'm always like wondering, am I doing it right? Is this how it's supposed to feel? Like it was different yesterday, or I forgot this part, like I mentioned earlier about forgetting, I can't remember what it was now. I already forgot the thing I forgot. But yeah, I think I do think that's normal and okay. And I think that devotion is kind of the answer there. I think like building that confidence in the teachings and letting, it's kind of letting go. It's a little bit of that process of releasing, grasping, and attachment, and just being present with a practice that when you're doing it, is it's not evident why it would work necessarily in the moment. And I think I know that's where I get a little hung up. I don't know about you too, but it's like you kind of think like we need to be doing more to make it work.
Yeah.
But does that address what you're asking?
I mean, I think also what I'm trying to say is, like, let's think about a meditational deity, or for example, Chenrezig. In my mind, I think of it as there is the part of where you can learn to understand all the different aspects, like we just did, for example, saying like, this is the symbolism for this and this. But I also see it in my, Western brain as I guess like a manifestation of the experiential thing which it gives you. So in other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, you might not be able to intellectually understand all the aspects of his parts, of his posture, and all the other things, but by sort of practicing Chenrezig or being devoted to him, or also like feeling seeing yourself as Chenrezig, my interpretation is that it still has the psychological, if you can call it that, effect on you, even so you might not have the logical understanding. In other words, if somebody is devoted to Chenrezig and practice him, or even just visualizes him or thinks of him as some deity which helps him, he still gets the benefit, even so he might not understand all the aspects, even to the point of what he is, if it's a real goddess or a god who floats around you. That's how I see it, because I think of it as a pure state visualization of a psychological state is not the right word, but of an experiential state in a form, and that form was created or was manifested to help you get that experience and get used to it. That's how I sort of try to do it in my logic. And I'm going, okay, so
Yeah.
even so in this moment when I totally forget what it is, I'm hoping that I'm sort of permeating this image and this feeling and this connection to this experience. Even so, I don't have all the the knowledge at this time, because there's a lot of knowledge in the Dharma to be known, and especially if you get into into deeper discussions on emptiness, and it's like it's an immense subject. Sometimes your head can burn very quickly. But anyway, so that's I think that's what I was trying to say. If that's, I'm hoping that's right still,
That it all resonates with me for
Mhm.
sure. I mean, I didn't hear anything that sounded unfamiliar. I think I have kind of the same experience. And I think that, one thing that came to mind is like, I'll never forget when Rinpoche told us in 3-year retreat, like no one ever studied their way to enlightenment.
Mhm.
So that's one thing that I always kind of remember. But there's also, I don't know, what was I going to say? No one's ever studied their way to enlightenment. And also the fact that we overcomplicate things. We have this tendency to want to
Mhm.
make things complicated, and also maybe the root of it is our habit energy towards figuring it out.
Mhm.
I know there's a very loud part of my brain that's always trying to run a commentary and explain.
Mhm.
Like it's just constantly doing that. And so meditation is one of the ways that I can start to turn the volume down on that. And it's definitely been my experience that maybe my greatest challenge is just doing the practices.
Mhm.
I mean that not just in terms of like consistency, but particularly in terms of like not trying to get too much into that figuring it out part, or the
I think-
running a commentary.
And funny that you say that, because I think exactly because of that is where my uncertainty comes from as well, because my logical brain says I have to understand these things. I have to figure out what's going on. I cannot just sit with it now, What does it do doing nothing in this moment, But sort of like training yourself to, that's why I always like I'm sitting there going, am I doing it right? Is this, because shouldn't it be, shouldn't I have studied this more and do it exactly like the
Yes.
instructions are? And I'm following the instructions, right? But you're right, it's probably exactly that which creates the uncertainty, but in the end, a sort of doubt for me specifically,
Yeah. And I think this, in a way, this goes without saying, but I have to remind myself of this all the time. Whatever happens in our meditation, it's not like it only happens in our meditation. It's probably happening all through the whole rest of our life too. And it's some kind of attachment that is habitual for us, that we should, if we're most often noticing it in our Dharma, we have to really start to turn the flashlight on other parts of our life too, because it's probably happening a whole lot more often in those places, and in likely causing us the same or greater suffering.
Definitely. Awesome.
Good question.
And by the way, this little meditation you did in the beginning was amazing. I loved it. It totally worked on me. It was
good.
Okay, great. You actually calmed me down somehow. I don't know how, but it worked.
Yeah. And I tried to, I just in the moment I was thinking about that aspect, because of the two kinds of touch, the like offering or the receiving.
Mhm.
And I hope that kind of tied in with our discussion of duality too.
Definitely.
That's kind of what I was hoping. Good. Any other thoughts? This has been a lot of fun. I really like spending time with you all.
Thank you.
Well, let's dedicate the merit. I actually have a slide for this. I have two. I want to do both of the prayers. I know the Karmapa has said, we usually do this one that you see on the screen now, but the Karmapa has said that we should probably do both together. So there's two that we usually will stay at the end at Columbus KTC, and I think a lot of times people will shorten it to just the one. But the reason I want to do two is because we have a sort of relative dedication that's about us benefiting beings and us attaining Buddhahood and all kind of working within the seeming framework of duality. And then we have this ultimate dedication where we talk about, you know, Manjushri, who knows everything as it is, and Samantrabhadra, who also knows in the same way. And we say, I want to follow in their path. And I remember I was lucky, I think right when I started coming to Columbus KTC was when Lama Yeshe Jamso was teaching still. And he was a fantastic teacher. Like I really wish he was still teaching. But I remember once he said that this prayer is like saying, I don't really know how to do this. Will you do it for me? So like when we make the relative dedication, that's kind of us saying this is what we want to do. But then when we do this, the second kind of ultimate dedication, we're saying, we're recognizing I don't actually fully realize emptiness, non-duality, but I want to do this like they would do it. So that's kind of how we make that intention and seal it all with the ultimate view. So let's say both of these today together. By this merit, may all beings obtain the omniscience of Buddhahood and defeat our common enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, may we free all beings. The courageous Manjushri, who knows everything as it is, Samantabhadra, who also knows in the same way, and also all the bodhisattvas, that I may follow in their path and completely dedicate all this virtue. And then let's just rest for a moment. Om Mani Padme Hum. All right.
Thank you, Lama.
Thank you, everybody.
That was great. Thank you.